The morning of June 22, 1941, was a tapestry of deceptive calm across the vast rolling plains of the Soviet Union's western frontier. Dew still clung to the grass, a gentle mist rising from the rivers, and the birds had just begun their dawn chorus, unaware of the inferno about to descend. Farmers were waking. Soldiers in border posts were preparing for their shifts, and ordinary citizens were stirring from sleep, their lives about to be irrevocably shattered. Then, with a suddenness that defied comprehension, the sky ripped open, not with thunder, but with the guttural roar of Stuka dive bombers, their sirens wailing a death knell before their bombs detonated with earth-shattering force. Artillery shells, thousands upon thousands, rained down across hundreds of miles, a metallic hailstorm tearing through border fortifications, barracks, and unsuspecting villages. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's audacious apocalyptic vision for the conquest of the Soviet Union, had begun. Millions of men, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, surged across the frontier like a tsunami of steel and fire. The shock was absolute, the scale unprecedented. Soviet intelligence had warned of an impending attack, but the exact timing and the sheer overwhelming might of the assault caught them catastrophically off guard. Divisions were decimated in their barracks before they could even mobilize. Airfields, packed with aircraft, were turned into burning wrecks within hours. Communication lines were severed, command structures shattered. The initial hours bled into days of utter chaos and terror. German panzer divisions, the spearhead of the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg, sliced through the vast Soviet territory with terrifying efficiency, their iron treads grinding across fields and villages, leaving behind a trail of smoke and devastation. The speed of the advance was mind-boggling, a strategic masterstroke for the aggressors, but a nightmare of unimaginable proportions for the defenders. Red Army soldiers, many of them young and poorly equipped, fought with desperate courage, but often in isolated pockets, cut off and surrounded. Thousands were captured, hundreds of thousands fell. The sheer scale of human suffering that unfolded in those first few weeks was beyond any previous conflict, a grim prelude to the 4 years of hell that lay ahead. Cities like Brest Fortress became symbols of heroic, doomed resistance, their garrisons fighting to the last man against overwhelming odds, their sacrifices already etched into the annals of a war that would redefine human endurance and brutality. The initial vision of a swift, decisive campaign, echoing the triumphs in Poland and France, seemed terrifyingly within Hitler's grasp, as the very existence of the Soviet state hung by the thinnest of threads, threatening to unravel completely under the immense pressure of the Axis onslaught. The world watched, aghast, as the Eastern Front became a cauldron of unprecedented violence, where ideologies clashed with a ferocity that would leave an indelible scar on humanity. A conflict driven by a genocidal intent that would reshape the continent and the very fabric of global power. The initial German surge, a torrent of panzers and infantry, carved deep into Soviet territory, exploiting the early disarray and the vast open spaces. The sheer weight of numbers, the tactical superiority, and the element of surprise meant that the Red Army suffered catastrophic losses in men and materiel. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed in colossal kessels, cauldrons around Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Millions of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, destined for a horrific fate in German camps, and untold numbers perished in the desperate, often disorganized attempts to break out. The logistical infrastructure of the USSR, already stretched thin, buckled under the strain, with roads and railways jammed with refugees fleeing the advancing front, and the remnants of shattered military units trying to regroup. Yet amidst this catastrophic retreat and overwhelming defeat, a deeper, more profound resistance began to emerge. It was not always coordinated, nor was it always effective, but it was born of a primal urge to defend one's homeland against an invader whose ideology promised only subjugation and extermination. Factories, entire industrial complexes, were dismantled piece by piece and painstakingly moved eastward, sometimes by river, sometimes by rail, often by sheer human effort, far from the reach of the advancing Wehrmacht. This unprecedented feat of industrial relocation, a testament to the Soviet Union's centralized planning and the grim determination of its people, ensured that the vital war production would continue even as the enemy hammered at the gates. The scorched earth policy, a brutal necessity, was implemented, destroying anything that could be of use to the enemy: crops, infrastructure, towns. This meant immense suffering for the civilian population, but it denied the Germans essential resources and slowed their advance, turning their lightning war into a grinding slog through a devastated landscape. German commanders, initially euphoric over their rapid gains, began to encounter unforeseen difficulties. Supply lines, stretching thousands of miles, became increasingly vulnerable to partisan attacks and the sheer immensity of the distances. Equipment began to break down. The infamous Rasputitsa, the autumn mud season, turned roads into impassable quagmires, and the vastness of Russia began to swallow divisions whole. The optimistic timelines for reaching Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev began to slip, replaced by a growing realization that this was not another quick victory in the West. The nature of the fighting was unlike anything the Germans had experienced. It was brutal, uncompromising, and fought with an ideological intensity that transcended conventional warfare. Every village, every forest, every river crossing became a battleground defended with a fanaticism born of desperation. This grim tenacity, often overlooked in the initial analysis of the Blitzkrieg's success, began to take its toll on the invaders, both physically and psychologically, preparing them for the ultimate test of endurance that awaited them as the long, harsh Russian winter loomed on the horizon. As the autumn of 1941 gave way to the biting winds and first snows of winter, the German advance, though still formidable, began to falter, its momentum drained by the colossal distances, the tenacious Soviet resistance, and the relentless strain on its logistical network. The objective, Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union, lay tantalizingly close, yet the cost of reaching it grew exponentially with every kilometer. The Wehrmacht, designed for swift summer campaigns in Western Europe, was ill-equipped for the brutal Russian winter. Men froze in their light uniforms, lubricants solidified in engines, and tanks, once formidable, became immobile death traps in the sub-zero temperatures. Supply lines, already stretched to breaking point, often failed to deliver essential winter gear, fuel, and ammunition to the frontline troops, many of whom were already suffering from exhaustion, frostbite, and dwindling morale. Yet it was precisely at this moment, when the German forces were most vulnerable, that the Soviet Union mounted its audacious counteroffensive. While the Germans had focused their strategic efforts on the central axis towards Moscow, the Soviet High Command, or Stavka, had been secretly redeploying fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East, troops accustomed to extreme cold and equipped with proper winter clothing. These were not just any soldiers, these were hardened, disciplined units, many of them veterans of border skirmishes, whose presence on the front lines was a closely guarded secret. On December 5, 1941, under the cover of a blizzard and temperatures plummeting to unprecedented lows, the Red Army launched its counterattack around Moscow. The Germans, frozen in their positions, many without anti-tank weapons or adequate defenses against the T-34 tanks that suddenly appeared through the snow, were caught completely by surprise. What followed was a desperate, bloody struggle in the icy wastes. The Red Army, though still suffering immense casualties, pushed back the exhausted, freezing German divisions, inflicting heavy losses and forcing them into a retreat. This was no mere tactical withdrawal, it was a significant defeat, the first major setback for the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht since the war began. The Battle of Moscow, a brutal testament to human endurance and strategic cunning, shattered the myth of German invincibility. It proved that the Soviet Union would not collapse, and that its people, despite immense suffering, possessed an unyielding will to fight for their homeland. The successful defense of Moscow, achieved through staggering human sacrifice and at a terrible cost, bought the Soviet Union precious time, demonstrating to the world that Hitler's blitzkrieg was not an unstoppable force, and marking a critical turning point in the psychological and strategic trajectory of the entire Eastern Front, offering a glimmer of hope amidst the vast darkness of war. With the dream of a swift victory in the east shattered before the gates of Moscow, the Wehrmacht, though reeling from the winter counteroffensive, was far from broken. Hitler, refusing to acknowledge the strategic blunders that had led to the Moscow debacle, purged many of his senior generals and took direct control of the military operations, a decision that would prove increasingly disastrous in the long run. In the spring of 1942, as the snows receded and the ground hardened, the Germans prepared for another grand offensive. This time, their objective was not Moscow, but the vital oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial heartland around Stalingrad on the Volga River. The rationale was clear: secure the oil to fuel the German war machine and cripple the Soviet economy by denying them access to their own crucial resources. This strategic shift meant a renewed focus on the southern flank of the Eastern Front. The summer offensive of 1942, codenamed Operation Blue, initially saw renewed success. German forces, concentrated in the south, once again achieved rapid advances, exploiting the remaining weaknesses in the Soviet defenses and pushing eastward towards the Don and Volga rivers. The sheer scale of the territory covered was immense, and once again, Soviet armies found themselves on the defensive, struggling to contain the German onslaught. The terrain, mostly flat steppes, favored the fast-moving panzer divisions, allowing them to bypass strong points and maintain a high pace of advance. The Luftwaffe regained air superiority in many sectors, providing crucial support for the ground troops and further hindering Soviet attempts to resupply and reinforce their positions. Yet, even amidst these renewed successes, the familiar problems of the Eastern Front began to resurface. The vast distances stretched German supply lines thin once more. The fierce, often fanatical resistance from isolated Soviet units, even when encircled, continued to bleed the German forces. The Soviet strategy, though costly, was evolving. Rather than stand and fight in every encounter, they often employed a retreat and delay tactic, drawing the Germans deeper into their territory, forcing them to expend precious resources and extending their logistical tail to unsustainable lengths. As the German spearheads raced towards the Volga, they diverged, with one arm heading towards the Caucasus oil fields and another, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus, given the task of taking Stalingrad. The city, bearing the name of the Soviet leader, was not just an industrial center or a crucial transportation hub on the Volga, it was a psychological and symbolic prize. To Hitler, its capture would be a monumental blow to Soviet morale and a personal triumph. For the Soviets, its defense became an existential imperative, a battle for the very soul of their nation, foreshadowing a conflict of unprecedented ferocity and human cost that would define the Eastern Front and ultimately the entire war. The stage was set for the most brutal urban warfare in history, a struggle where every building, every room, every inch of ground would be fought over with unimaginable tenacity and suffering. The German Sixth Army, spearheaded by some of the Wehrmacht's finest units, reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in August 1942. What began as a strategic objective, the capture of a key industrial city and Volga River port, quickly transformed into something far more symbolic, a brutal crucible where the ideologies of two totalitarian regimes clashed in an apocalyptic struggle for survival. For Hitler, taking Stalin's city was a personal obsession, a propaganda coup. For Stalin, losing it was unthinkable, a humiliation that would have shattered the morale of an already battered nation. The ensuing battle defied all conventional military logic. The Germans, initially employing their standard blitzkrieg tactics of combined arms and rapid maneuver, found themselves bogged down in a nightmarish landscape of rubble and shattered buildings. The city itself, bombed into oblivion by the Luftwaffe, became a labyrinth of broken concrete, twisted metal, and smoldering debris, a perfect hunting ground for Soviet defenders who knew every nook and cranny. Fighting degenerated into brutal close-quarters combat, often hand-to-hand in the ruins of factories, apartment blocks, and basements. Snipers became legendary figures on both sides, their silent kills adding to the creeping terror. Every stairwell, every factory floor, every pile of rubble became a contested territory, fought over with grenades, bayonets, and sheer bloody will. The Red Army, under the command of General Vasily Chukov, was ordered to hold the city at all costs, with "not a step back" as the mantra. Reinforcements were ferried across the Volga under constant German artillery fire and aerial bombardment, often thrown directly into the inferno with minimal preparation. Casualties mounted at an astonishing rate for both sides. German soldiers, accustomed to open-field maneuvers, found themselves disoriented and exhausted, battling a tenacious enemy in an environment that negated their technological advantages. Soviet soldiers, many of them young recruits or citizens pressed into service, fought with a desperate courage born of conviction and the chilling knowledge that retreat meant execution. The human suffering reached unimaginable levels. Soldiers fought without sleep, without adequate food, surrounded by the stench of death and the constant roar of battle. Civilians trapped in the city endured the same horrors, struggling for survival amidst the ruins, becoming unwitting participants in a conflict that consumed everything in its path. Stalingrad became a meat grinder, devouring men and machines, a grim testament to the destructive power of modern warfare and the unyielding determination of soldiers pushed to their absolute limits. It was not just a battle for a city, it was a battle for an ideal, a test of wills that would ultimately determine the fate of the Eastern Front. The strategic significance of Stalingrad was undeniable, but its symbolic weight was even greater. To win here meant not just holding a river port, but breaking the enemy's spirit. As you reflect on the sheer desperation of those fighting for every inch of ground in that ruined city, enduring unimaginable conditions and facing constant death, what do you think truly sustained them? Was it ideology, fear, patriotism, or something deeper, a primal human will to survive and protect? Share your thoughts on what drives individuals to such extremes in the comments below. It's a question that echoes through every major conflict and still resonates with us today. While the battle for Stalingrad raged within the city's ruins, a far larger and more audacious plan was secretly being prepared by the Soviet Stavka. Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, recognizing the overextension of the German Sixth Army and its flanks protected by less experienced Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units, devised Operation Uranus. This wasn't just a counterattack. It was a colossal pincer movement aimed at encircling the entire German force trapped in the city. On November 19, 1942, under the cover of a thick fog and amidst a brutal snowstorm, the northern pincer of the Soviet offensive struck. Freshly reinforced Soviet armies, supported by vast numbers of tanks and artillery, smashed through the thinly held Romanian lines north of Stalingrad. The Romanians, often poorly equipped and ill-motivated, were overwhelmed and quickly routed, creating a gaping hole in the Axis defenses. The next day, November 20th, the southern pincer attacked, achieving similar devastating success against the Romanian forces to the south. The two Soviet spearheads, driven by a furious momentum, raced towards each other across the vast snow-covered steppes, their objective the town of Kalach-on-Don. Within just 4 days, on November 23rd, the pincers met at Kalach, effectively trapping the entire German Sixth Army, along with elements of the 4th Panzer Army and various Romanian units, within a vast pocket around Stalingrad. Approximately 250,000 to 300,000 Axis soldiers were now encircled, cut off from supply and reinforcement. The shockwaves of this encirclement reverberated throughout the German high command. Hitler, still blinded by his strategic obstinacy, famously forbade General Paulus from attempting a breakout, insisting that the Sixth Army hold its ground and be supplied by air. This decision was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, lacked the capacity to adequately supply an army of this size. What was promised as 500 tons of supplies per day often amounted to barely 100, leaving the trapped soldiers to slowly starve and freeze. Conditions within the Stalingrad pocket rapidly deteriorated into a living hell. Ammunition dwindled, food ran out, and medical supplies vanished. The relentless cold, the constant Soviet artillery bombardments, and the ever-present threat of attack wore down the German troops, many of whom were already exhausted from months of brutal fighting in the city. Attempts to relieve the trapped army, most notably General Erich von Manstein's Operation Winter Storm, were launched in December, but they ultimately failed to break through the tenacious Soviet defensive ring. The Sixth Army was left to its fate. The slow, agonizing destruction of the trapped German forces unfolded over the next 2 months. Starvation, disease, and frostbite claimed thousands of lives daily. Morale plummeted, and the once proud Wehrmacht units disintegrated into isolated groups of desperate, freezing men. On January 31, 1943, General Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler just hours before in a cynical attempt to prevent surrender, finally capitulated. The remnants of the Sixth Army, approximately 91,000 men, marched into Soviet captivity. Stalingrad was over. The battle's end marked a monumental, irreversible turning point on the Eastern Front, shattering the myth of German invincibility and signaling the beginning of the long, brutal Soviet push westward. It was a victory forged in unimaginable suffering, a testament to the raw courage and strategic brilliance that would ultimately turn the tide of the Great Patriotic War. The capitulation of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad sent shockwaves across the globe, a seismic event that fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of World War II. It was not just a military defeat, it was a profound psychological blow to the Axis powers, a symbol of their faltering momentum and a massive boost to Allied morale. For the Soviet Union, it was a moment of immense triumph, a vindication of their unyielding resistance, but one paid for with unimaginable sacrifice. The cost of Stalingrad in human lives and devastation was staggering, leaving a grim legacy of suffering that would haunt generations. Yet the war was far from over. The German war machine, though wounded, remained formidable, and Hitler, despite the monumental setback, clung to his vision of victory. The spring of 1943 saw both sides regrouping, licking their wounds and preparing for the next decisive confrontation. The Soviets, emboldened by Stalingrad, sought to press their advantage, while the Germans aimed to regain the initiative and stabilize their eastern front. The stage was set for the Battle of Kursk, an engagement that would become the largest tank battle in history and would definitively determine the future course of the war on the Eastern Front. The Germans, recognizing the bulge in the Soviet lines around the city of Kursk, planned a massive pincer attack, Operation Citadel, to cut off and destroy a significant portion of the Red Army. They assembled their best armored divisions, including the new fearsome Panther and Tiger tanks, hoping to deliver a knockout blow. The Soviets, however, anticipated the German move. Through excellent intelligence and a deep understanding of German strategy, they had advance warning of Operation Citadel. Instead of meeting the German offensive head-on with an immediate counterattack, they decided to adopt a deep defensive strategy, creating an elaborate multi-layered system of fortifications, minefields, anti-tank ditches, and artillery positions stretching hundreds of kilometers. This defensive preparation was unprecedented in scale and depth, designed to bleed the German panzers dry before they could even reach the main Soviet defensive lines. On July 5, 1943, the German offensive began. What followed was a colossal clash of steel, fire, and human courage. The German tanks, though technologically superior in many respects, found themselves mired in minefields and subjected to relentless artillery barrages. Soviet anti-tank guns, hidden in camouflaged positions, exacted a heavy toll. The skies above Kursk were filled with aircraft engaged in furious dogfights, while on the ground, hundreds of tanks rumbled towards each other in chaotic, close-quarters engagements. The climactic phase of the battle occurred at Prokhorovka, where hundreds of Soviet T-34s and German Panthers and Tigers collided in a swirling melee of metal and fire, a truly apocalyptic spectacle of modern warfare. The fighting at Kursk was a brutal war of attrition, a test of endurance and resolve. Despite heavy losses, the Soviet defenses held. The German offensive ground to a halt, unable to break through the layers of Soviet resistance. By mid-July, with their reserves depleted and a new Soviet counteroffensive launching on other sectors of the front, Hitler was forced to call off Operation Citadel. Kursk was a definitive strategic victory for the Soviet Union. It marked the permanent loss of the strategic initiative for Germany on the Eastern Front, ending any hope they had of regaining the offensive. From this point onward, the Red Army would be on the offensive, relentlessly pushing the Wehrmacht back towards Germany, transforming the war into a relentless pursuit across thousands of miles of devastated land. The tide had definitively turned, setting the stage for the final brutal chapters of the Great Patriotic War. With the defeat at Kursk, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front irrevocably shifted to the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht, having suffered irreplaceable losses in men, tanks, and aircraft, was now forced into a long, arduous defensive war, a struggle they were ill prepared for and ultimately doomed to lose. The Red Army, though having paid a horrific price for its victories, was now more experienced, better equipped, and imbued with an unshakable confidence. The years 1943 to 1944 witnessed a series of massive Soviet offensives, each codenamed after a famous Russian general, that systematically pushed the German forces westward, liberating vast swaths of occupied territory. The summer of 1943 saw Operation Rumyantsev, which liberated Kharkov, and the Battle of the Dnieper, one of the largest operations of the war, where the Red Army successfully forced a crossing of the mighty river, liberating Kyiv in November. The fighting was still incredibly fierce, often descending into brutal battles of attrition. The Germans, despite their numerical inferiority and dwindling resources, fought with tenacity, often employing brilliant defensive tactics to slow the Soviet advance. They built formidable defensive lines, such as the Panther-Wotan line, attempting to stem the tide, but the sheer weight and momentum of the Red Army proved unstoppable. The logistical challenges for the Soviets were immense. They were pushing through territory devastated by years of war, with destroyed infrastructure and scorched earth. Yet their engineers worked tirelessly to repair railways, build bridges, and clear minefields, ensuring that supplies could keep pace with the advancing front. The partisan movement, which had been a thorn in Germany's side since the beginning of the invasion, intensified its operations, harassing German rear areas, disrupting supply lines, and providing crucial intelligence to the Red Army. These partisan fighters, often operating in harsh conditions behind enemy lines, played a vital role in weakening German control and paving the way for the main Soviet forces. The spring of 1944 brought even larger and more devastating Soviet offensives. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944 to coincide with the Allied D-Day landings in Normandy, was a truly monumental operation that shattered the German Army Group center. Within weeks, the Red Army advanced hundreds of kilometers, destroying or severely crippling over 24 German divisions and liberating Belarus. The scale of this victory, often overshadowed by the Western Front, was immense, further exposing the critical weakness of the German position in the east. Throughout this relentless drive, the Red Army liberated cities and towns that had suffered under brutal German occupation for years. The discovery of the atrocities committed by the Nazis, the concentration camps, the mass graves, the deliberate starvation and extermination of civilians, fueled a burning desire for revenge among the Soviet soldiers. This desire, coupled with a deep sense of patriotism, pushed them onward through mud, snow, and fire towards the ultimate goal of driving the enemy out of their homeland and into their own territory. The sheer human cost of these operations remained staggering, but the strategic tide had turned decisively, transforming the battle for survival into a relentless march towards Berlin, a journey that would ultimately conclude in the heart of the Third Reich. As 1944 drew to a close and the new year dawned, the Red Army stood poised on the borders of pre-war Germany and its satellite states. The relentless drive westward had pushed the Wehrmacht back across thousands of kilometers of liberated Soviet territory, then through Poland, Romania, Hungary, and into the Baltic states. Each advance was marked by ferocious fighting, immense casualties on both sides, and the grim discovery of the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. The Soviet soldiers, fueled by a potent mix of patriotism, revenge, and a deep sense of duty, were now fighting on foreign soil, bringing the war directly to the perpetrators. The nature of the fighting remained brutal. The Germans, despite their increasingly desperate situation, continued to resist fiercely, defending every town and village with a fanaticism born of fear and ingrained loyalty. They knew what awaited them if the Soviets reached German soil, having themselves inflicted such devastation and cruelty on the East. This resulted in some of the most intense and bloody battles of the entire war, particularly in places like Budapest, Königsberg, and the Baltic pocket. The Soviets, for their part, perfected their deep battle doctrine, employing massive artillery barrages to soften up enemy positions, followed by waves of infantry supported by tanks, often bypassing strong points to encircle and destroy German forces. The scale of their operations was unprecedented, involving millions of men and tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft. The logistical challenges of sustaining such a massive offensive over vast distances were monumental, but the Soviet supply lines, though strained, held. In January 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, a lightning-fast operation that saw Soviet forces advance hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks, shattering the German defenses in Poland and reaching within 70 kilometers of Berlin. This offensive was a strategic masterpiece, tearing through the last vestiges of German organized resistance on the Central Front and opening the direct path to the German capital. At the same time, fierce fighting continued in the south as Soviet forces pushed into Austria and Czechoslovakia, and in the north, where the siege of Königsberg became a symbol of German last-ditch resistance. The race to Berlin, however, became the ultimate prize. Stalin was eager for the Red Army to capture Berlin, both for its immense symbolic value and to ensure Soviet influence in post-war Europe. The Western Allies, also advancing rapidly from the west, initially considered a drive on Berlin, but ultimately halted at the Elbe River, allowing the Soviets to take the German capital. The final assault on Berlin in April 1945 was a truly apocalyptic climax to the war in Europe. Two Soviet fronts, under Marshals Zhukov and Konev, converged on the city, engaging in a brutal street-by-street, house-by-house battle against desperate German defenders, including remnants of the Wehrmacht, Waffen-SS units, and hastily organized Volkssturm militias composed of old men and boys. The city itself was a shattered ruin, but every building became a fortress, every street a killing ground. The fighting was intense, costly, and utterly unforgiving, a grim testament to the final bitter end of the Third Reich. The Battle of Berlin in April 1945 was the culminating inferno of the Great Patriotic War, a cataclysmic urban struggle that saw the final desperate death throes of the Third Reich. With the roar of 1 million shells falling on the city, the Soviet advance into the heart of Berlin was a methodical, grinding process, each street, each building, each underground bunker becoming a scene of unimaginable ferocity. Marshals Zhukov and Konev's forces, totaling over 2.5 million men, were pitted against a ragtag defense of exhausted Wehrmacht soldiers, fanatical SS units, and hastily armed civilians, including children and old men, fighting for a regime that had already lost. The Soviets, hardened by years of brutal campaigning, brought overwhelming firepower to bear, employing heavy artillery to blast holes in fortified buildings and then sending in assault groups with flamethrowers, grenades, and submachine guns to clear out the defenders. Tanks rumbled through the rubble-strewn streets, often falling prey to Panzerfaust ambushes from the ruins, while snipers and partisan fighters continued their deadly work. The fighting was claustrophobic, dirty, and utterly merciless. Beneath the surface, in the labyrinthine bunkers of the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler, surrounded by his last loyalists, continued to issue delusional orders, clinging to the belief that some miraculous intervention would save his regime. His mind, already detached from reality, refused to acknowledge the obvious, that the hammer blows of the Red Army had utterly crushed his empire. As Soviet soldiers raised their red banners over the Reichstag on April 30th, a moment of immense symbolic significance, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, taking his own life rather than face capture and judgment. His death, a macabre climax to a life of hatred and destruction, marked the end of an era of unprecedented evil. 2 days later, on May 2nd, the remaining German defenders in Berlin finally surrendered, exhausted and out of ammunition. The fighting ceased, and the once proud capital of the Third Reich lay in smoldering ruins, a stark monument to the futility and horror of war. While Berlin fell, fighting continued in other pockets across Europe. On May 8, 1945, with the instrument of unconditional surrender signed by German representatives, the war in Europe officially came to an end. Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, was celebrated with immense joy and relief across the Allied nations. For the Soviet Union, it was the culmination of 4 years of unimaginable sacrifice, suffering, and heroic struggle. The Great Patriotic War, a conflict that had claimed the lives of tens of millions of its citizens, destroyed countless cities, and devastated vast swaths of its territory, was finally over. The Red Army, having started as a shattered force in 1941, had marched all the way to Berlin, defeating the most formidable military machine of its time. The victory was absolute, but the cost was astronomical, leaving an indelible mark on the nation and its people, a triumph etched in blood and tears, forever defining the generation that lived through it. The peace that followed would be fragile, but the immediate cessation of hostilities brought a profound sense of relief, marking the end of the most destructive conflict in human history, born from the ashes of a continent consumed by ideological hatred and unparalleled violence. The silence that descended over Berlin after the final shots was not just the absence of noise, it was the quiet echo of millions of lives lost, a chilling reminder of the ultimate price of tyranny and resistance, shaping the geopolitical landscape for decades to come, leaving behind a legacy of resilience and memory that continues to define modern Russia and the world's understanding of that epic struggle. The war was over, but its scars would remain, deeply etched into the land and the souls of those who survived, a constant reminder of the incredible human capacity for both destruction and endurance. The cheers that erupted around the world were tinged with the sorrow of remembrance, a collective sigh of relief mixed with the profound understanding of the ultimate cost of freedom, marking the close of a dark chapter in human history. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief, yet the echoes of those years would continue to resonate, shaping policies, memories, and the very fabric of global society, serving as a perpetual lesson on the fragility of peace and the devastating consequences of unchecked aggression, ensuring that the sacrifices made on the Eastern Front would never be forgotten. The victory was not merely military, it was moral one, a testament to the unyielding spirit of a nation that refused to break even when faced with annihilation, ultimately contributing to the defeat of fascism and reshaping the geopolitical order for the latter half of the 20th century. The sheer magnitude of the human cost, the devastation, and the eventual triumph would forever mark the Great Patriotic War as a defining moment in the history of the Soviet Union and indeed the entire world. And as we remember the incredible story of resilience, sacrifice, and ultimate victory against overwhelming odds, we must never forget the lessons learned and the immense price paid for peace. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Historia for more deep dives into the defining moments of human history. Your support helps us continue to share these vital narratives, ensuring that the echoes of the past guide our future. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of human endeavor.